let's talk about more about procedures and processes, because obviously we talked about the appropriations, authorizations process, and I know that you think about these kinds of procedures more. Can you talk about what you see there in terms of how it's evolved and what are the problems and what solutions you think there might be?
I think the biggest problem that prevents Congress from being a Congress is the Rules Committee and the centralization of power on the Speaker. And Congress hasn't always been this way. Sometimes we've had very strong committee chairs. You think back to the days of the Dan Rostenkowskis, and Congressman Purcell, and all these, Dante Fussell, the Florida, all these strong dynamic chairs. Who used to, John Dingell, right? God forbid if you got a letter from John Dingell asking you to testify before the committee because you're in trouble. To a point now where you don't have any strong committees, you just have a strong speaker. Now, the speaker maintains their power in the Rules Committee, and what the Rules Committee notoriously does is just blocks all amendments. By definition, Rules Committee sort of sets the agenda. So how long you're going to debate a bill, how many amendments are allowed, this sort of thing. And in the last Congress, we didn't have a single open rule, which meaning amendments are all allowed. And that's a bad thing, because that means members of Congress can't go offer amendments on the floor like you would in any state legislature, any county government, for Pete's sakes, you could do that. But here in the biggest and most important legislature in the world, members of Congress aren't allowed to offer amendments from the floor. And that's just wrong. And what it means is that people are not being represented. It's one thing, if your member offers an amendment and loses, well, you had your say, you had your chance to make the argument. So your constituents' views are represented. But if you're not even allowed to offer the amendment, then your constituents' voices are basically silenced. And it's inefficient, it's messy, and so that, yes, sometimes it's much more difficult. But instead of passing a bill that's purely a political statement, maybe you got to offer amendments to both sides and come up with something that actually might make some positive change that can also, by the way, pass the Senate, because you've got bipartisan contributions to the bill. And so I think procedurally, this is where we have to go back. I would favor requiring supermajorities to have closed rules on certain bills, like appropriations or tax bills. There are some things, you need to speed the process along, suspensions and things like that. Sure, you don't have to have open rules for those sort of things, but on major legislation that's going to affect a lot of people's lives, there should be a supermajority required for the Rules Committee to impose, a blockage of all amendments. So that'd be one way they could go back to doing it. We always talk about regular order, and of course in the House, regular order means this is what we're supposed to do, but we're not going to do it, In the Senate, they don't even know what it is. I mean, it's unanimous consent and exhaustion. But in the House, following their own rules would go a long way towards actually having healthy debate again. And as I said, you don't have to do it in every bill.
Well, for the amendments, I'm curious, obviously it sounds attractive to have more amendments and offer up the views as you mentioned. Of course, there's a counter argument that most of the amendments offered are zingers, or they're messaging rather than substance. And so how do you create an incentive against that kind of behavior? Well, or do you think that behavior is fine?
I think good leaders have ways of controlling that. You'll get some zingers, right? Now the Senate, someone offers a zinger amendment, motion table, non-debatable, you shut it down. Or someone offers a tough amendment in the House. Okay, fine. We're going to offer a tough amendment ourselves. Now, we can keep doing this all day long. You want to keep swinging, we'll swing back, or we can get down to business. And this is leadership that makes that happen. Yeah, it's the ability to talk to your counterpart. Tip O'Neill could talk to Bob Michel. I'm not sure Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy do a lot of talking. And I think this is a part of the problem is that, if you can talk to the opposition and say, here's my objective. In fact, you could see them having weekly meetings like they used to do. Here's the objective. Here's what I'm going to do. Well, what do your people think? Well, some of my people are real upset about these provisions. We'd like to offer some amendments. All right. We'll offer amendments. We'll try to beat them. They go on that way. When Tip O'Neill was the speaker and Ronald Reagan was the president, we had this whole thing with the Iran-Contras, right? There was a rebel group fighting the new Marxist-oriented government in Nicaragua. And every year they would have a debate on whether or not we should fund this group. And Tip O'Neill was totally against it, and Ronald Reagan was totally for it. But Tip O'Neill always allowed the debate. Even though he sometimes lost, the next year he might turn around and win. But he always allowed the debate because that was what Congress is, and that's what legislation is supposed to be. Putting the issues before a group of representatives and letting them vote. So I think this inability to vote on important issues just stymies the creativity. No one pays attention to the floor. I mean, it's all scripted out beforehand. As soon as you see the rule issued, you know you're going to have this much debate. You know which amendments are in order, so you know how you're going to vote long before it ever happens. And so you go off to make fundraising phone calls or do something else or meet with constituents. You never even look at the TV. You hear the buzzers and you go vote because it's all choreographed. Well, I think it'd be better if members had to pay attention to the floor. If members had to go down there and be ready to fight, over some instant amendment. I remember I had a boss once, and there was something called the nuclear freeze movement during the Reagan era, right? And part of the idea was to limit the ability of the U.S. to negotiate or missiles by saying that we had to freeze the ones we had. Now, Reagan didn't want to freeze them because they had a whole bunch of older missiles that he wanted to replace with these new shiny Minuteman missiles which had 10 warheads, right? So the nuclear freeze made that impossible. Well, as they're debating this resolution, my boss, a freshman, throws an amendment in where it says the nuclear freeze, and he put and/or reductions. That was his whole amendment. He wrote it on a piece of paper, handed it in, right? And it set the whole place in a huge panic because, of course, it didn't sound bad. We wanted to freeze or reduce the weapons, so that's good, right? Well, no, because it threw off the entire idea that to prevent Reagan from being able to build new missiles, right? And so everyone went wild and crazy. All sorts of people came out and gave spontaneous argument because since the amendment was written, the staff couldn't write up their speech notes for them, right? They had to argue from their heart and what their head. And we ended up losing by 7 votes, but which was, and we were in deep minority at the point. So we actually won a bunch of Democratic votes on that. But I remember being on the floor and how excited the floor was. It was just a buzz because everyone said, oh my goodness, we got to do something about this. Or this guy's got a great idea. Let's go fight for it. And was that a great moment or not? I just thought it was a great way to see Congress in action because they had to use their heads. They had to use their skills. It was Congress performing the way it's supposed to perform, I think.
Right. So any other kind of process procedure areas where you feel there's, opportunity for improvement, particularly maybe as it relates to the committees, if you have any ideas there?
Yeah, I think there should be opportunities for people that go beyond just the discharge petition. Because, discharge petition, it's been used sometimes, but usually it's more of a leverage. And the discharge petition being the idea where a majority of members can sign a petition, force the committee to discharge the bill. And so my thought on that is that, if you get a certain number of co-sponsors, maybe that can say the committee got to bring up the bill. So you get 300 sponsors. That's more than majority or some 2/3 number, something like that. Members should be able to drive a process by which they force the committee to consider a bill. I think a good committee chairman will anticipate that happening and then take actions to get a bill more to their liking. But that's okay. It's leverage, and that's how a lot of legislatures work. So I would like to have some sort of like super endorsement that sort of gives members an idea that they can get a bill done more easily. And I think if you just get the Republicans ought to get rid of their term limits. I think that's a dumb idea because they have a brain drain every 6 years because some of their most talented members leave because they've lost their job. Democrats haven't done that yet. They have a problem with the seniority system, which prevents their younger members from moving up. So there's a happy middle ground there somewhere. At least the Republicans just say they don't count the number of years when they're in the minority against them for the chairman. So right now, if Kathy McMorris Rogers is the new ranking member on the Energy and Commerce Committee, well, they take the majority in 2 years. She would only be there for 4 years, right? With the 6-year rule. Well, don't count those first 2 years against her. When she was in the minority, go right to the majority and get the full 6 years there. And maybe extend it. So I think there's some process forms they could do. I'm happy to see them reintroduce earmarks. I think this is an important process. I mean, philosophically, I think earmarks are a good thing because they're constitutional. Right? Congress is the one who's supposed to appropriate money, not leave it to the executive branch to make all these decisions. You're elected by your constituents to be their top advocate and fight for them. And you should be in a position where you can say, this is the most important funding project that should be done in my district. I know because, my constituents tell me so. You make it completely transparent so your constituents can hold you accountable. We didn't agree with that project. That seems to be too much of a favor to a developer friend of yours or something. And, you hold them to account. My rule of thumb has always been on earmarks. If you're not willing to issue a press release on it, you shouldn't do it. We had those problems with Duke Cunningham and the black ops budget. They were top secret. No one knew what those earmarks were until after they happened. That's no way to do it. They have to be transparent. But the key thing about this is it allows members of both the minority and the majority to legislate. And this is healthy for Congress because, they always said the best job in town was being the minority in the Senate because you could stop anything, but you had responsibility for nothing. The worst job is being the minority in the House because you have no power and no ability to stop anything. But now even members of the minority would be legislating on behalf of their constituents with real priorities. So that even if they weren't, obviously the majority gets to shape the bill because they won the election, right? But the minority can go home and say, look, I may not be in the majority, but I was able to get these things for you as you're a member of Congress. And then all of a sudden that creates a sort of bipartisan cooperation because if I got things in the bill from my district, I'm probably more likely to vote for your authorization bill, your appropriation bill. And now we get bipartisan majorities instead of these sort of political battles, which take place where the extremes of each party hold their centers hostage by saying, oh, we won't vote for you. And the other side won't vote for you. So therefore you're going to lose unless you give in to us. Well, if you can go to the minority and say, look, my extreme won't give it to me. If you give me 40 votes, I'll give you these amendments. Now a leader can sort of go bipartisan to sort of force the Congress to be more centrist. And the goal of being centrist is not a political goal. It's how you get consensus. And you're more likely to get something through the Senate if you can show that you have multi-party support. So I think I like this idea of reintroducing earmarks and bring them back with a very open, transparent process.
One thing I think that's interesting about the earmarks system and its kind of suspension, if you will, was the fact that the rule to stop the earmarks wasn't in the chambers themselves. It was in the parties. So it was kind of a party rule. Yeah. And that made me wonder more about this concept of party rules versus rules in the chamber and what the relationship between those are and how binding are they. And maybe you have some insights in that you could share since I think I read that through part of your testimony.
Yeah, I think this is something that we ought to encourage a more open process for these decisions. I mean, parties determine a lot of things in their individual caucuses. Who gets on which committees? Who are the chairs? Who are the ranking members? Things like earmarks. It was a Republican conference decision to cancel earmarks that did that. And then the Democrats, not wanting to be outdone, did in their caucus rules, and then the Senate did the same thing. But you're right, no one ever passed a rule banning earmarks. They're still legal according to the rules of the House. It's just it was party conferences who controlled this. And they do have a lot of power. And, for instance, they elect their leaders. The only leader who's elected by the entire House is the Speaker, but that's nominated by the two conferences chairs, right? So it has a lot of power to determine the structure and who's who in the House is determined by these rules. And that's an inside game that some people will complain that both parties tend to reward with key committee seats members who raise more money for other members. Should that be a criteria for determining who's a good chairman or not? It's a good team player, perhaps, but that might not be the best chairperson. Maybe we should have some other criteria determining those things. But if it's invisible and behind the scenes, you never can, how do you influence it? So I'd like to see that be a little bit more transparent. The Republicans at least publish their rules. The Democrats, I think they're about to, but that's a departure for them. But that'd be a great thing to see if they do that.
And the rules for the parties, how are they determined? They're just determined by the chairman, or they have some kind
of the conference
internal process to determine what rules they want to follow as a group?
Usually they have votes on them, just like they go into a mini legislative session with just their own party, right? And so they can offer amendments to these rules and they can offer changes. For instance, today, March 17th, the Republicans in the conference just moved to remove that earmark rule and say they're going to go back to accepting earmarks again. This was an internal vote. They actually did it by secret ballot, which you never see on the floor. And so members of Congress are able to get this done internally. The Democrats had already done this. And so it was kind of like a challenge to Republicans. We're going to do earmarks. If you want some, you're going to have to do it too. And they voted today to go ahead and do it. So sometimes they end up working off in tandem with each other, but they are almost like little mini legislatures inside with their own internal rules about who's who. You remember a few weeks ago, Liz Cheney had to survive her vote to maintain the conference chair position because of her vote on impeachment, and which she did. But they can do that. They can throw you out. Your own conference, if they don't like what you did, they can throw you out and they take revenge on you. So, it's a kind of a check for people to say, okay, I don't not only have to worry about what goes on the floor, I have to worry about what my own colleagues think in my own party.
Right. Well, great. Let's move on to another subject I've heard you talk about, which is this concept of colleges and Congress. Could you talk more about that and what you have in mind for that idea?
I'm glad you raised it, because one of the biggest problems, I think, to retention of good quality staff in Congress is that it's the only branch of the federal government that has no tuition reimbursement. And they have some where they'll reimburse some of the interest you paid, after you finish college, as you're serving on the staff. But I think that if you're asking people to work on the $4 trillion budget on some of the most complex technological issues in the world, you should allow them to get additional education as part of their job to help them do their job better. And so one of my ideas is we have all these schools in Washington offering graduate degrees. Why not bring them together in a College of Congress, where the Congress pays for the staff, instead of doing tuition reimbursement, it just pays their tuition up front. With these different groups, people can choose and they can get a 2-year degree that gives them a credential, but also gives them a lot more knowledge in the areas where they need to be good at their jobs. What I like about this is that, one, it makes them better at what they do, but two, it gives them an incentive to stay. Because right now, the staff leaves too quickly. And so by staying and getting these degrees and getting this credential and then using it on the committees or in the personal offices, you have a chance to make a huge contribution on important issues when we actually start legislating again, because you have so much more knowledge and preparation than you had before. It's interesting. I got my master's in legislative affairs after I finished my congressional career. And part of the reason was that when I was looking for jobs originally, people said, well, we don't want chiefs of staff. We want legislative directors because they actually get things done. So wait a minute, how do you think they got things done? So I got my degree in legislative affairs, and it was actually one of the most rewarding things I ever did, because I realized that when I was in Congress, I learned just enough to get through that day. And then we're on to another issue tomorrow. Now, all of a sudden, you can study things like executive orders, how many different kinds there are. How do they work? How do you undo them? What are the court's rulings in these? I found it fascinating to go back and look at these things I kind of knew a little bit about, and then get a lot more knowledge on it. So I've sort of taken this whole idea of spreading knowledge really seriously. We wrote the book Surviving Inside Congress, which was a key to staffers to sort of get their feet wet, and to other people trying to understand the Congress, how it works. But I think something like this with the college would be the perfect thing. A bipartisan, willing staff could go and take some tough courses and become better educated at what they do. And I'd like to see it happen. We'll see. It might take a little bit more bipartisan cooperation before we can get there, but I hope we can.
It's interesting. So maybe I'll just poke you a little bit more on that issue, because one thing is the general concept of training, right? It could be university, or it could be something internal to Congress, and in retreats is also potentially in this area.
Yeah.
The role of training in Congress. Some people will be skeptical and say it doesn't really work, but it sounds like your experience was helpful. So would you say that's a general conclusion on training?
I think the more training they can get, the better. Everything from just how to manage your office properly to learning more about the issues in depth. It does work, and some people does. You get some people up there, they get it up to the hill, they find out it's not these big marble offices they saw on TV, and they're doing nothing but answering constituent mail, and they leave, right? Because they can't take it. But other people want to be there, but they're right out of school, and so they've had no real world experience. When you let them get training and educated by the hands of people who've already done these things, it's like a combination of education and mentorship, where it allows them to become better at what they do. And let's face it, it's in our interest to have these people being very successful at what they do, because everything they do affects us. If they're going to pass laws that affect the way we live, well, I think we want them to be well educated before they go ahead and do that. And they're the ones advising their members. Your members have a specialty, but they can't know everything. There are too many issues. There are 10,000 bills introduced each session of Congress, each the most important thing to somebody in the world. Some bills have a lot more somebodies than others, but your staff has to sort of have a grasp on everything, or at least learn how to learn it. A member can't. They have to rely on their staff for solid knowledge and memos and briefings and question ideas and background studies on different issues. And so the more prepared, the more enabled the staff is to do that on an effective basis, the better off the member's going to be too.
Right. Well, let's move on to the lightning round, we call it, where we ask you the same questions we ask all our guests. And ultimately, we'll see how people agree or differ on the answers. So the first question here is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
I think it's a good combination of being aware of what your constituents want, but having some firm principles that are very clear that you're never willing to break. Henry Hyde once said that a member should understand the reasons they'd be willing to lose as deeply as they understand the reasons why they came here in the first place. Because his idea was that as long as you say principle, issues come and go, but principles don't. And so if you can stay firm in your principles, then you'll be a good representative. And if you can't, then you're just going to be kind of wishy-washy, and you might be here for a while depending on your constituency, but I don't think you're a very good representative. I'd much rather take passion.
Right. So it sounds like in your view, the beliefs of the district are there, but the representative needs to make his own judgments about what's in their long-term best interest.
Exactly. I'm a little bit of a cross between the Wilson School and the Burke School. I think that you do have to maintain your district's needs because that's why you're there. I mean, that's the Constitution puts you there for a reason. But you also have to be, since we're a Republican form of government, where you're elected to use your judgment, you have to use some judgment too. So I think if you outline your principles and your constituents understand those principles, you can go back and explain why you did what you did, even if it wasn't popular. And they say, well, okay, that's what you said. I may vote against you because of it, but at least you were honest with me up front. I saw a lot of members. I remember the Patient Protection Act, Obamacare. There were a lot of Democrat members who were really happy to see this come because they fought their whole life to get this bill through. They wanted some sort of more government plan. And the polling changed in that dramatically from when it first passed. Barack Obama had 70% approval. And by the time they got around to the final passage was March, and Obama's ratings were way down. The bill wasn't any popular anymore. And a lot of people said, well, if you're from a red district, you can't vote for it. I said, no, I had always stood for this. I'm going to vote for it, knowing that I'll lose anyway. And they went down and they lost their elections. Some of them won anyway. But their principle was so important that I can't change now when I finally got everything I wanted to get. So it's, I admire members of Congress who have this kind of deep set principles and an attempt to gather power for good purposes. Obviously, there are two kinds of power gatherers: people who get power for power's sake, and that helps their ego and things like that. And then people who get power to do something good. Now, our interpretation of what good might change from party to party and ideology to ideology, but I admire those people who are passionate about what they believe. And I think they make the best members of Congress. Or maybe if they did, we'd have more of them, but I think they make the best members of Congress.
All right. Next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
I would say the Congress would spend half and half. I think you need to get out to your constituents and see your people and understand them, make sure you stay touched, and then spend the other half legislating. I might not do it though, like week in, week out, week out. I might do it for longer segments of time where Congress is there for like a month and then they go off for 2 weeks or 3 weeks and they come back for a month. And then they go back for 6 weeks or whatever, but fairly evenly spread between the district so they keep their firm footing and the roots from where they are, and then actually legislating. One of the things that disturbs me greatly about this is the whole idea of proxy voting, though, whereas you can be voting in Washington when you're not in Washington. I think that's terrible, and I hope it stops once the pandemic is over, because to me, the very word Congress means people coming together in mutual respect to work out complex issues with diverse people to get a consensus that we can live with. But you have to get there to meet with people. Now, this is great, Zoom, and you and I are having a great conversation, but can you think of any place in the world where you'd be staring at a person for an hour when you're talking to them? You don't, right? The body language, you think, you look, and you observe how people are thinking, you finish their sentences, you watch, you can see who reacts negatively to an idea just from their body language. And this is communicating, and you got to do that in person. So 50-50 is what the time, as long as you get rid of proxy voting. So members will actually be in Washington when they're in Washington.
And when they're in Washington, so now they're in Washington for 50% of their time, and you may blur the distinction between these, but legislation versus oversight, what would your split be?
Oh, great. I think they should spend most of their time on oversight, which is less sexy unless it's a big issue. Everyone likes the big issues, the Russia investigation or Fast and Furious in Benghazi. But it's the day-to-day oversight of each little department agency where Congress really has its power. And I think they've abandoned that. That's a mistake. And so they all want to talk about the big bills, and they pass political bills that have no chance of passing the other body. And that to me is more of a communication function than a legislative function. The true legislator is conducting oversight because that's where accountability takes place. And that, quite frankly, is where Congress's power is. Because their ability to hold the executive in check is where they get their real power. So I'd like to see more oversight. I love a great bill as much as the next guy, right? Because I used to write them, and you co-sponsor a bill or sponsor a bill, and you're always proud of it. But Congress doesn't have to pass that many bills to be effective, especially if it has a healthy amendment process. But if it doesn't do oversight, it loses its power, and that's a dangerous thing.
All right. My next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
I think you should have a more open process and more people get to talk on the floor. I think, if you want to do a 2-minute rule or 5-minute rule, in the House, obviously the Senate's different. You can talk your head off, for as long as you want. But I think you should have this structured, and we should go back to sort of the expectation of civility. I think they've gotten a little bit away from that. It used to be that you were uncivil. They bring the mace down and stand in front of you and take down your words. And I guess they do that every once in a while now, but it was a big embarrassment in those days. Now it's sort of like a badge of honor. They took down my words. And I think part of the problem is since it's mischief, when you're not legislating, you get mischief. And so social media provides plenty of opportunity for members to be mischievous and go on and yell and scream about things when they should be out working. And, the oversight hearing may be a lot more boring than going on Fox News and taking a 5-minute shot at the other party. But if you want to actually be a good member of Congress, that's where you do the work.
So the floor is where you would like to see more of this dialogue, debate, and in committees.
More than committees. I think you will always have more bipartisan cooperation in committees because they have common interests. The advantage of also encouraging that, though, is, of course, then you have a bipartisan advocacy for the bill on the floor. And I think that helps to get the bills get through better. It also makes the quality of the amendments better. I think amendments that are bipartisan they're offering tend to be some of the most interesting amendments you ever get on big bills. I can't give you an example because I haven't done one in years, but back when they used to do that, where you'd have both members of both parties would come up with this unique amendment, and they'd battle against the committee chairs, and they were the most interesting ones you had because there's bipartisan support on both sides of these things. So I think the healthy committees make for a healthy floor debate. The healthy floor debate with an open amendment process it makes for a healthy Congress, and that's where Congress work should be done.
All right. Next one is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
I think the best improvement they can make is to diffuse power within the leadership and go to a more open process on the floor. And I think this is the key thing. I keep going back to that, is that, power is good as long as power is being used to effectively shepherd legislation through. When power is used to block legislation or to make it purely partisan, Congress breaks down. And I think the danger is the more Congress breaks down, the more it loses power of the executive. We're fortunate. I mean, we have an executive Congress that's well established. It's been here for 230 years, and it's not going to go away easily. It's acquired a lot of powers and all that. You look at new Congresses in some parts of Europe, or like in Egypt, the legislature lasted a short period of time, right? Because it wasn't established, and the president was strong, and they took back power. Well, our presidents, will always take whatever power Congress gives them. From Barack Obama with his pen and phone to, Donald Trump with his regulations and his executive orders, and Joe Biden's doing the same thing, but so we see it all over again. But whenever the president does an executive order that's supposed to be legislation, Congress has given up its power. Good example, and just to not keep us long, is immigration, right? In Article 1, Section 8, immigration is an enumerated power of Congress. It's their job to come up with solutions to things like DACA and the border and legalization process, but they don't. And so the president comes up with executive orders and does it for them. And Congress doesn't complain because, it's a tough issue. They didn't want to take that vote, but they just surrendered their power. And don't get me started on war powers, right? Congress is supposed to be the only one to declare war. They've done it 5 times. I think we have more than 5 wars going on now, right? They've completely abandoned their war power to the executive branch. And maybe that's just caused by history and the nuclear movement. And obviously, if the Russians are launching a nuke, you can't hold a committee hearing on it, right? So,
Right.
but it's unfortunate. But Congress, when every time they give up power to the executive, it's a little bit more dangerous thing, because the executive that's unchecked will tend towards authoritarianism. I'm not accusing any of our presidents of being authoritarians, but that's the trend. And if you're talking about a 50-year timeline, we could get there easily if Congress doesn't improve its esteem in the eyes of the people by doing its job.
Right. Next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
Boy, there's been some interesting things. It's actually a great book that I read after we'd started some of these ideas, but I thought was really good. Is George Will did a book called Conservative Sensibility. And he does one chapter completely on the role of Congress versus the president. And he talks about the important constitutional origins of why Congress should take back its power and do its job. And I thought that, I often see government activists tend to be on the left. I said, boy, I'd like a lot of my conservative friends to read this, because he really talks about the danger of an overly powerful president. And he uses a lot of examples, like with Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt as being progressives that had no use for Congress. But in the future, in the modern era, we can see this too, where presidents think Congress is in the way or their annoyance. But he makes the overwhelming case for the constitutional basis that the Declaration of Independence is sort of our charter, and the Constitution, which is based on freedom. The Constitution is the thing that takes away our freedom to a degree so we can live together as a country. And this constant tension between the two is where Congress's role is played out. It's also where the court's role is played out. And so I thought that was a book that I read that was very good. The other thing I think was, there's two classic books that I always urge everyone to read, is Robert Rumini's book called The House, which is it's almost like you can follow the history of the Rules Committee as the history of the House. You look through that and you see where the power has been shaping it and things like that. And then the first 100 pages of Carroll's book on Lyndon Johnson, Master of the Senate. He does this tremendous history of the Senate going all the way back. And to give you an idea how it worked when it was working right, you look at this first chapter in that. When I was teaching at George Washington, I would tell my students, buy the book on Amazon, you can get it for like $3, and just read this first 120 pages or so about the history of the Senate, because it's a lot better than reading Robert Byrd's 5-volume set, and you get this instant flavor of what it's supposed to be like. And, and part of understanding how it works is part of the understanding of why it doesn't work. So that's important to see too.
Great. Well, the last question is just about your future plans with, the Institute and the work that you're doing.
I am looking forward to getting back to work with this pandemic ending. We do a lot of retreats. So I meet with a lot of people, and, this business we're people, right? We like people. And this whole idea of not being able to talk to people directly and communicate, I think is very dissatisfying professionally. So I'm looking forward to getting back to that. And, I think that we have besides this idea of holding retreats, getting members together, I take our management efforts very serious to try to make Congress work better from inside out. And so if we can do some good management, provide some better staffers, and get back to meeting with people and helping them do their jobs better, I can't ask for anything more in life. So I'm content man if I can do that.
Great. Well, Mark, thanks so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Matthew, it's been great being here, and I love the excuse to talk about this stuff. So thank you for being a great host.
Yeah, thank you.